All right. Hi there, everyone. Thanks for so much for coming. My name's Alyssa Murphy. I'm the Civic Engagement Librarian. I recognize some of you guys. So I work upstairs on the desk a lot. So some of you guys might recognize my face behind the mask or my voice, or we've talked to each other before. So tonight we're going to be using a hybrid format. So that means that we have attendees in person and attendees online. So if you're watching from home, know that we are using the webinar format in Zoom, which means that you can see and hear us, but we unfortunately cannot see and hear you. So we will have a question and answer segment at the middle and the end of the presentation. So if you're watching on Zoom, you can submit your questions at any time by entering them into the Q&A feature. You can find this on your Zoom toolbar by clicking on that button that looks like two speech bubbles. If you don't see this button, like if your screen's too small or if you're using a different device, if you click more or on the button with three dots, it should give you that option. So for those in person with us, just to make it fair, if you can also just hold your questions until that period at the middle and then that period at the end. So on Zoom, we've also enabled the live transcript option. If you want to disable the words at the bottom of your screen, just click on the closed captioning button. If you don't see the button with the CC, similarly to the Q&A, click on more or the three dots button and then select hide subtitles to get rid of those. In the library, we have our assisted listening system. If you'd like to borrow one of these devices, please ask the staff member sitting at the back of the room. That's Jez. You guys might know Jez. She's wonderful. To turn it on, simply press the power button and then you can adjust the volume using the up and down arrows. Additionally, we do want to remind everyone that in the library, we're required to wear masks and keep it on the whole time. And then also just please put your cell phone on silent and your other devices on silent. If you do need to take a call, feel free to wander on out and take the call. Bathrooms are located down the hallway near the parking lot entrance, so like right by where you came in. And then if you do need to leave the room at any time during the presentation, please just try to do so as stealthily as possible. And then check to make sure, are we going to close the door, Jazz? Okay, so just check to make sure the door closes behind you. And let's see. If you are having any technical difficulties, please call the library at 630-279-8696, or you can chat with us. If you go to our website, just click on that Ask Librarian button, and then there's folks standing by to help you with Zoom if you're having any trouble with it. So I think that's all we've got for the beginning housekeeping. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So the topic of the presentation is fake news, real news, and how to tell the difference. So if you're not there for that, you can mosey on out now. Okay, there we go. All right, so first off, what we're going to cover is why is fake news a problem and how to spot it. And then we're going to go over the difference between fake news and partisan news, because I think sometimes in the media, there's a lot of confusion over, news that's just out and out fake versus news that's just hyper partisan and written from a particular slant. We're going to evaluate biases of real news as opposed to fake news, and then get some ideas about how to get multiple sides of a news story. And then at the end, we are going to flex our fake news and fake people spotting skills, which is super fun. And the first time I did the fake news spotting skills, I got like half of them right. So it is pretty tricky. All right, so first off, why is fake news a problem? And I figure most of you guys agree that fake news is a problem if you came into this program. But just to make sure we're kind of all on the same page, fake news actually leads to increased polarization. So that quote there from Marty Barron of the Washington Post sort of encapsulates that if we're not all working with the same information, it's hard to have a conversation, because if you and I disagree on the basic facts of something, it's hard to even, start the conversation because we're coming from two totally different points of view. Another thing that fake news can lead to is just cynicism and disengagement. I did a program like this about a year ago that was actually like a Be an Informed Citizen one. It was right before the election. Some of you guys might have come to that one. And when I was going over fake news a little bit, someone was like, well, if it's all fake, what can I believe? So they were just, really disengaged and cynical, because if you can't trust the news, then like, what's the point of even engaging? So fake news can, bring down our engagement. It also drowns out real news sources. So like fake news is always going to be, more interesting and exciting and sensational than anything real news can come up with. So if you kind of think of fake news, like that really interesting junk food, And then real news like that, stuff that you ought to be eating every day. Particularly the lack of like robust local journalism can correlate with lower voter turnout, more polarization, like we mentioned earlier, erosion of civic engagement, and then less oversight of of local government. And especially with local news sources, there's typically fewer of them. So there's kind of more of a risk of those sources going away. I mean, if you think of it in terms of Elmhurst, like we have the Elmhurst Suburban Life and we have the Independent, but like if both of those news sources went away, there wouldn't be anyone covering like those very local issues that are important to us, but maybe not important to someone as nearby as like Downers Grove. So now we're going to go over some tips to tell if it's fake news. And bear with me, I'm just going to take a little drink of water here. So if you can't read the picture, we have this very attractive picture of Mr. Lincoln telling us that the problem with quotes found on the internet is that they are often not true. And I can guarantee you all that Abraham Lincoln totally posted that on the internet. So the first tip is to consider the source and read beyond the headline. So if you kind of just imagine yourself like scrolling through your Facebook newsfeed, and the example I gave a few years ago was about Trump, but let's talk about our current president. So let's talk about Joe Biden. So let's imagine you're scrolling through your feed and it says on there, Joe Biden eats live iguana. Now, if you see that, you're gonna be like, no, that doesn't sound right. Like that doesn't necessarily sound like something Biden would do, but let's say that you really hate Biden and you really love iguanas, you might be like, oh, that sounds just like that Joe Biden. So it's very important to, read beyond that headline and consider where something is coming from. So like if you see that the source is, abc.com.co, you might be like, oh, that's from abc.com. But if you click on it and you look a little bit deeper, you'll figure out that ABC's real URL is abc.com. And abc.com.co was actually like a fake news site that came out around 2016 and was posting a bunch of sensationalist articles with that URL that's really similar to abc.com. So sometimes, especially stuff that you find on social media, can be really sneaky and it can try really hard to look like the real thing. Or like if I see something posted from like, I don't know, the Philadelphia Gazette and Free News, I might be like, oh, that's a name that sounds real legit. But like, that's just a name that I pulled out of my head. So it's always important to look at like, well, where is this coming from? The next thing is to look at, is it opinion piece or is it actually news? Oftentimes, like if you're reading the newspaper, it'll specifically say editorial at the top. And other things do this differently. Like I don't listen to a lot of television news, but I was at my mother-in-law's house recently and she had CNN on in the background. And I was like, oh yeah, CNN, sure, whatever. But then like they started doing like a news segment that was just like very partisan. And I was like, I didn't remember CNN being, this partisan. And then I realized it was an opinion segment. Like it was some person that they had on to talk about their specific take on things. So it's always good to look into whether you're seeing one person's opinion or if you're seeing something that they're presenting as actual news. Another good thing is to check your author's credibility. So if you're reading an article about, oh, I don't know, let's just pick something totally irrelevant, about COVID, for example, and you're reading this article and it's like, oh, person realizes that, you never have to wear a mask ever, ever, ever. And then you look at the author's credibility and you realize that it's like, I don't know, just, some random person who works at the local gym and who wants you to come to the local gym, you might question whether that's something that's truly coming from, something that you can trust. So I'm not necessarily saying that you can't, choose to read that article and choose to, take on what that article has to say, but it's important to consider where something is coming from. And just consider also like what that person has to gain. So like if I worked for example, Nutri-Grain, and I posted an article somewhere that said Nutri-Grain bars make you sexier and handsomer and healthier and just like ever so happy, you might be like, oh, okay, wow, Nutri-Grain bars are really great. But if you look at like who paid for that study or who wrote that study, you might realize that it's not necessarily by somebody who has your best interests at heart. Another thing to do is to check how recent This was something that came up a lot in 2016, just because Donald Trump has been in the public eye for so long. You would see things posted like about Home Alone 2, where Donald Trump had like a very small cameo. And they would post it like it was this brand new thing, like, oh my gosh, Donald Trump was in a hotel lobby and gave directions to this small boy. And it's like, first of all, that was from a movie. And second of all, that was from like, I don't know, 15 years ago. So it's always important to check how recent something is when you're evaluating it. And then another one to check is the obvious, is it satire? So I think everyone has seen, someone on social media who bit the onion, so to speak, and who posted a satire article as if it was real. So if you see an article that's just, too funny to be true, it's worth checking to see if it's a satire website, especially if it's one of the ones you haven't heard of. For example, recently I had a friend who showed me an article and I was like, oh, okay. I hadn't, heard that before. And then like when I looked at it a little closer, I realized it was a satire website that I just hadn't heard of yet. And unfortunately, I've forgotten the name of it, but I know it was like, it was like a left-wing satire site. Another thing to check is if anyone else is reporting on this story. So like going back to the Biden eating a live iguana example, if you only see this thing about Biden eating a live iguana on abc.com.co, it's worth considering whether such a big story would have gone unreported on by so many other major outlets. So it's something where, if you just type into your search bar, Joe Biden iguana, and the first thing that comes up is that article. And the second thing that comes up is Snopes.com, debunks the Joe Biden eating a live iguana story. It's worth, considering whether that's something you actually want to believe. Another thing is if there's an image with the article, you can actually do a reverse image search in Google to find the source of the image. So if we go onto Google, I can find you guys kind of a good example. Let's see. Here we go. So this was an article that came out that claimed that, here we go, if it's going to show us the picture here. Let's see. So it looks like it doesn't want to show me the image. I think if I click on images, it'll give it to me. There we go. So there was this groundbreaking ceremony where there's a picture of every member of the Trump family who's holding a shovel. You know how at groundbreaking ceremonies, everyone will hold a shovel. So you see here that one of the Trumps is holding their shovel with the handle facing outward. So it turns out that that image was actually fabricated. So somebody took the real image of him holding the shovel properly and then turned it around and edited it just to like make a funny story like, haha, Eric Trump doesn't know which way to hold a shovel. If you want an example on the other side, people will often do this with Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. They'll do things like this where they'll edit an image in like a funny way to try to make a point. But if you're reading this article, it's like, oh yeah, it really does look like he's holding that shovel the wrong way. Like you can see they did a pretty good job with the Photoshop. So it's always worth doing that reverse image search to see like, okay, what does the real image look like? And is that image only coming up in like one particular place? So going back to this. And then the last thing, this is kind of just something that you have to ask yourself. Are you believing this article too easily because it confirms your existing biases? So let's see. Can somebody yell out a politician so that I'm not picking on the same people? Or literally just anybody? Lori Lightfoot. Okay. So let's say that I really don't like Lori Lightfoot. If I go online and I see an article that says something like, I don't know, Lori Lightfoot, pees in local pool and laughs about it, I might be like, oh, that sounds just like that Lori Lightfoot, whom I already dislike and am willing to believe very bad things about. So especially when it's something like that, that confirms an existing bias that you already have, that's when you extra have to take a breath and pause and see if you can find other sources, because we're most vulnerable to fake and misleading news when it confirms something that we kind of already suspect. Like fake news doesn't, come out of the ether. Like that's why my Joe Biden eating an iguana example is kind of just funny, because there's not already an undercurrent in our culture of like, oh yeah, those Democrats love to eat iguanas. But like a more serious example would be like, let's say if it said something like, I don't know, Biden flies to Mexico, takes 50 children to the United States and gives them a free education. Like somebody might be like, oh, that sounds just like those Democrats, or, oh, what a nice thing for Biden to do, depending on how they're viewing the situation. So especially in those situations where the article, confirms something that you kind of already thought, that's when it's extra, extra important to take a step back and think about it before you share it or before you believe it. So as I promised to earlier, we're going to get a little bit into the difference between fake news and partisan news, because they're not the same thing, but oftentimes people will talk about them in the same sentence without discriminating which one that they mean. So fake news, as you've kind of probably already gotten the idea from me talking about it, is just, completely fake stories that are designed to either be inflammatory or funny or mimetic in some way, and they're designed to be widely shared. So like when you read an article that, says Lori Lightfoot pees in the pool and laughs about it, and then you share it to your Facebook, you're doing exactly what they wanted you to do. And fake news definitely exists, but partisan news is actually a lot more common. And the best course of action with fake news is just to, figure out something is fake news, disbelieve it, and then try not to share them. And then if you're feeling really civic, you could even go in and say, hey, I, have reason to believe this is fake, like in the Facebook comments, be like, I don't think this is a real story. So that's what you want to do with fake news. But with partisan news, it's a little trickier. Stories that are at least partially true, but they're told in a way that supports a particular viewpoint. So I have an example a couple of slides later, and I'm just going to go there now. So an example of the same story reported from two different viewpoints. So this is something that happened in Seattle back in 2006. So I believe it was the Seattle PI reported operator in crane wreck has history of drug abuse. And then I believe it was the Seattle Investigator reported winds may have weakened crane. This was actually their first reporting on these stories. So it was the same story reported by two different newspapers. And you can see that you're getting a completely different point of view. So it really does depend on the news source that you're reading. And these stories are not fake news. There really was a situation where there was a crane wreck operator and there was, or a crane operator and there was a wreck. It's just that these two news sources are coming at it from completely different, sets of biases, and they have a completely different agenda for sharing this story. So let's go back. So almost all news is a little bit partisan. So it's hard to find this sort of, holy grail news source that always tells the truth with no slant and is just straight shooter, because even a news source that tries to do that is still having a bias in the fact that they have to select what to cover. So they have a limited amount of staff, they have a limited amount of reporters, they have a limited scope. So the stories that, I choose to cover versus the stories that I choose not to follow up on is in itself kind of a bias. You can often see examples of this, for example, when a good example would be if you go to websites that are like anti-LGBT, you might find that they're going to report every instance of any time that an LGBT person does any sort of crime, even if it's just like, local gay man jaywalks. And they're going to be like, oh, those gay men always jaywalking. And then you might go to another news source and find that no one's reporting on that. So even just the stories that you choose to report on, whether they're true or not, is a form of bias. So the best course of action is to read critically using multiple news sources. And then this is really important, try to be aware of the bias of the news source you're consulting. So I'm not saying that, you never ever want to read, XYZ source. I'm saying that when you read that source, you might just want to be, this is a source that I know to have an extremely liberal bias. So I'm going to read this with a grain of salt, and I'm going to read, news sources that have a more central outlook or have a more right outlook. And I'm going to put those together and I'm going to come up with my own opinion. So you never just want to take one news source and just make it your whole personality. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like we all have that friend who's like, oh, I heard it on the XYZ news, so it must be true. And, oh, did you hear this other thing from XYZ news? Like, you have to make sure that you're consulting multiple news sources or you're inevitably going to have blind spots. So here is an example from a really handy website called All Sides, which I'm actually going to show you in a little bit, of some of the more common news sources and their bias. But something that I mentioned on the previous slide and that's important to note is that news sources' biases can actually shift over time. So on this particular slide, a good example of that is if you see that CNN is in the very, very left column, CNN used to be very slightly left. Similarly, Fox News is in the very, very right column, but they've actually moved further rightward just in the last 10 years. So like if you've got a source that you've been consulting for a very long time, you might find that over time their coverage, whether it's due to staff changes or whether it's due to, you know, what they're determining is getting them more views, you might see that their coverage starts to change after a while. So I think it's always important to look at what you've been reading and be like, well, have they, you know, changed lately? Have they, you know, gone further left or further right, or even, you know, in some cases further center. So we'll skip that because we've already used it. So now I'm going to show you guys, actually, you know what, let's go ahead and take a break for Q&A. I feel like this is a good time to stop before we start getting into specific sources that you can use to try to figure out fake news. So Jez, do you have any people on Zoom? Yeah, go ahead. Totally. This one or the one before it? That one? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a good question. So Jez asked, she noticed that there are some names that are actually in multiple columns. So for example, AP, Associated Press, is in both the center column, and then AP, Politics and Fact Check, is actually in the slightly left column. So this is a good example of times that opinion becomes really relevant. So for example, for NPR, you can see that NPR's actual news coverage is pretty center, but NPR's opinion coverage, so like, you know, the people that they choose to give airtime to give their opinions, tends to lean a little bit more left. So you actually see this a little bit too, gosh, I want to say it's one of our local papers. The Chicago Sun-Times recently, I've noticed, has like been very middle of the road for their coverage, but then some of their opinion columns lately have been skewing a little bit more right. I don't know if any of you guys have used the election binder in the past. The way I'm determining that is when I make the election binder, I print out all of the endorsements. And I noticed that some of the endorsements have changed like which party that they're endorsing, which always makes me a little bit interested. You know what I mean? Like, oh, that's interesting. They endorsed a Republican last time. This time they're endorsing a Democrat or vice versa. So it's important to note that there's a difference between a source's like straight news coverage versus the way that source does opinion and handles the difference between news and opinion. And the best news sources don't necessarily always have like that center bias, but they do make a clear distinction between things that are news and then things that are opinions. So you always want to look for news sources where, you know, it always says like editorial or, you know, opinion from our editor or whatever. So if that kind of answers your question, Jez, right? Let's see, do we have any in-person questions? And then we'll go back to Zoom questions. Yeah, go for it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. So to repeat the, oh, yeah. Yeah. So to repeat the, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, things where it's not super local. Do you mind if I repeat the question for the folks on Zoom? Just because with the way the microphone's set up, they could actually only hear me. So a gentleman in the audience mentioned that he typically reads like right-leaning news sources, and that when he shares these articles with his wife, she often says, okay, but what are you going to do about it? Like, what are you going to do as a result of reading this article, and how is being better informed affecting you? Am I understanding that right? Okay. Yeah, so there's actually been a lot of discussion about this. So there's an author, I believe his name is Ezra Klein. I have one of his books actually on the back, and he talks a lot about this issue, and he calls it bystander or spectator politics. I think I might be getting that term wrong, but I know it's either spectator or bystander. So there's this, large group of Americans who, they'll be up on all of the latest news, and they'll know everything that's going on, and they'll be, like on tenterhooks watching the news, but then they won't necessarily go vote in their local election, or, they might not, donate to either party, or they might, be very, very well informed, but not really do anything. So I would say one of the best things that you can do is, yes, stay aware of things that are happening at the federal level, but the area that most people can have an impact is actually at that local level. So for example, if you are somebody that, tends to lean right, like it might be worth getting in touch with the local Republican Party and seeing if they need like a precinct committeeman, for example, which is like that form of government where like you're very much in your own neighborhood, you know what I mean? So you're talking to your own neighbors about, Republican issues or Democrat issues, and then helping them make the plan for how to vote. So that would be an example. Or, you're talking to friends and family, like not necessarily trying to convince your friends and family, but talking to your friends and family about your viewpoints and, discussing about how, you can have an impact on that local level. So I would say, well, it's very important to stay informed at the federal level, if not only for, dinner party conversation topics. It's also really important to take that information into your own community and make a difference at that community level. Otherwise, it is very easy to, sort of treat it like, the outcome of a hockey game. Like, oh no, the Republicans lost again, but that's okay. We'll get them next time and we'll win the cup this year. So I think it's one of those things where it is important to know that, it's easy to kind of get trapped into that sort of spectator mindset. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. And I think that's a big part of it. So one of our attendees mentioned that, it's interesting to think about it from that very local Elmhurst level, because that's where our tax dollars go. And that's, the library and the park district and the schools are, what we're interacting with every day. Jez, do you have a Zoom question?
Yes, so Marty has a comment and a question. And he says, I was surprised the hill was in the center. My perception was more to the right. And then the question is, how would news from Google News be classified?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So sometimes with these particular ratings, so this is from a specific site called All Sides. So, I mean, I hate to say it, but even All Sides, I don't know their bias, but they're probably coming into it with a bias too. And there are actually a lot of different sites that do similar things to All Sides, where they'll, give you an idea of, which way certain news sources lean. As for Google News, I might be incorrect about this, but I believe that Google News is actually an aggregator of news content. So it's not so much that, there's a bunch of people sitting at Google, writing up journalism. Google is bringing a bunch of other news, usually from things like the Associated Press, and then putting them in a nice, easy to browse feed for you. So I think in the case of Google News, their bias would probably be more at the algorithm level. So like which news sources they're choosing to collate rather than a bias of them particularly. So it'd be kind of like, if you're familiar with the website Reddit, it would be like, oh, well, what's Reddit's bias? Like in a lot of ways, Reddit's bias is the bias of its users. So similarly, if Google News is an aggregator, like I think it is, their bias is going to be a bias in their algorithm of which news they're choosing to put together. And I'm just going to check that really quick. Yeah, so you can see Google News is aggregated from sources all over the world. So it's not that Google News itself has a bias, it's that the algorithm that's recruiting the news may have a bias. Let's see. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So do we have any more in person? And then we'll go back to Zoom. All right. Any Zoom questions?
Well, Marty mentioned, I think I remember I can tell Google News not to show me news from specific sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with Google News, it sounds like what they're basically trying to do is they're trying to provide you a service. So it's not that Google News is, trying to show you what Google thinks about things. Like they might be, but in general, what they're trying to do is they're trying to give you an easy place to digest all of your news at once. So from Google's point of view, they're looking at themselves sort of as the proverbial piece of paper on which you're reading the news rather than the purveyor of the news. And I would argue that there's still a bias and that their algorithm is choosing what to show you. But you can definitely, mitigate that bias or in some ways enhance that bias if you want to by choosing not to look at or choosing to look at certain news sources. But Google itself is not writing up the reporting. See, any more Zoom?
All right, we had a question, where's the media chart from?
Yeah. So the media chart is from a website called All Sides. And let me go to the slide that has all of my links on it. And I will actually just take us to All Sides so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's see. Not sure what browser it's going to take us to, so it'll be an adventure for all of us to see if we end up in Chrome or Firefox. It looks like Firefox. Oh, nope. Maybe Chrome. Let's see. There it goes. Looks like Firefox. So what allsides.com does is they actually bring together perspectives on the same stories from multiple news sources. And they'll show you like a column that says left, a column that says center, and a column that says right. Frustratingly, they actually don't necessarily put the left, right, and center columns on the left, right, and center. And the reason for doing that, stated on their own website, is that there's actually a bias in doing that because left is the side that we read from. We read from left to right. It would actually advantage the left if that's the one you're always reading first. So it looks like this one actually is, yeah, here we go. So you can see, for instance, this one is center, left, right. So they move it around so that they're not introducing a bias by always having you read the left points of view first. So this is actually a really good place to start if you're looking to start reading things from multiple points of view, because it's going to, obviously you can't flatten American politics to just left, right, and center. Like not everybody is a Republican and not everybody is a Democrat. Like, there's a lot of different shades, but it is kind of a good way to start with your news, to read things from different points of view. And sometimes even just in the headlines, you can see that there's a bias, for example. Let's see. So, for an example here, you can see that the left is calling this border apprehension. And then you can see that, the right is going all in and just using the word arrests. And I'm sure you guys can figure out that border apprehensions is a very different energy than border arrests. So you can even see in the headline sometimes that there's a bias being introduced just by the way that the story is being framed. Let's see, any more Zoom questions before I move on? Oh, perfect. Okay. So I'm going to move on to showing you guys some more different sites. So bear with me here. Whoop. I can just exit off. Is that right? Okay. Here we go. And then hopefully our hyperlinks open a little more quickly this time. There we go. So Media Bias Fact Check is another site that purports to be able to categorize different news sources into certain types of bias, except they have a few more types. So they talk a little bit about conspiracy, pseudoscience, and sources that are questionable, sources that are satire, and sources that are pro-science. So let's go ahead and click on this least biased, because this is something that I think I get asked a lot, where people are like, well, what can I read? Because I don't have time to read things from 17 different sources. I just want to read one thing and go about my day. It can sometimes be good to try to find things that are at least striving to be unbiased. that are at least trying. Because I think that there are other news sites out there where if you ask them like, oh, do you have a left bias? They'd be like, heck yeah, we do, or vice versa. So this is a list of sites that, tend to be as unbiased as they can. So if you look through this list of sites, and you can see it's a really, really long list of sites, this can sometimes be a good place to start. And they actually do give you an idea of how they evaluate their sources. And they also, and this is very interesting, they show you sources that have been reevaluated. So like I mentioned earlier, where sometimes sources will veer more left or veer more right over time. They show you sites that they've actually given a different rating because their coverage has started to change. So I'm going to go over each site pretty quickly just because I want to make sure to show you all of them. But the handout that we sent you through email, or in the case of people here in person, the handout that you have in front of you has all these links on the back so that you can go to these sites on your own time and just click around and have some fun. So most of us have probably heard of Snopes. I know it's been around as long as I've been using the internet. So what they used to focus on, and what they still focus on, is urban legends, but more and more recently they've focused on like news and debunking things that, are tending to get a lot of clout online or are getting a lot of shareability. So you can see that they go into things that have been like in the news lately, for example. So let's see if we can find a good example here. Let's go with this one. So I don't know if any of you guys have heard about this, but there's been a thing recently on the website TikTok where a lot of people have been making videos of themselves and showing off that the different tics that they have. And there are some, some conditions that can cause those tics. And they say that there's been like a big uptick recently, or uptick recently in people who are presenting with these tics. So Snopes went in and did a deep dive to see whether you can truly say TikTok is causing these tics versus making people aware that they have them. So Snopes can be a really good resource when there is like a question like that, or when there's a situation where there is, ambiguity, or a situation where there's something that's gone big in the news and maybe the fact has lagged behind the sensational story. Snopes can be a really good place to look. Another useful resource is Procon.org. So one thing I really like about Procon.org, this is not so much something that's really good for in the moment fact checking. This is one where if you've heard of an issue for the very first time. So let's say, for example, that I have never, ever even heard of the fact that pit bulls are banned, for example. Like I just heard from one of my family members, oh, did you hear that they're banning pit bulls in XYZ state? And I'll be like, oh my gosh, I didn't hear that. Procon.org is useful because they're actually going to show you all of the information that they can on both sides. So it's not so much that they're trying to convince you one way or the other. It's that they want to show you the primary arguments on both sides. So like if you're, let's say you're going to Thanksgiving and there's a family member with whom you always tangle on a particular political issue, Procon.org can be a good place to stop just to be like, okay, so what are the dominant arguments on both sides of this issue? And obviously most issues have multiple sides rather than just both sides. But I find that Procon.org often does a good job of distilling an issue down to like, its core things and like the stuff you should know about it. So like, I'm not even a huge dog person. So like, I might go through here and just read these and be like, okay, I feel like I sort of understand more or less where both sides are coming from with this whole pit bull issue. And they do cover a lot of different topics. So if you scroll through, you can see that most of the topics that are a big deal get covered, and they cover new topics all the time. So, like if something happens in the news, they'll often have something about it later, and they update pretty frequently as well. So another one, and this one is kind of fun, actually. It was originally a project of the Tampa Bay Times, which is a newspaper in Tampa, obviously. And they eventually affiliated with something called the Poynter Institute. And they give a lot more information about like, where they came from and who they are. That's actually something in common with all of these sites. They're all like extremely finicky and transparent about making sure that you know everything that could possibly bias them before you start to trust their ratings. Because it's very easy to say, oh, well, who are you to say whether something is fact or fiction? They'll give their background and they always cite their sources. So it's nice to know that you can always take a deep dive. So PolitiFact is, kind of fun because they just categorize various claims into these categories you can see here. So, everything from true to mostly false to their kind of, tongue-in-cheek rating pants on fire. So if you scroll through here, it'll show like the claim that they're making, and then it'll show, what exactly they're basing that on. So let's click on this one. So if you scroll down here, so this is the if your time is really short here, let's just give you the short version. No, Hunter Biden is fine. If you scroll down a little bit though, it's going to give you this whole write-up of, all of the actual information. And it's interesting here that they're talking about a video being legitimate versus illegitimate. It's absolutely true that with the technology that we have for videos and for images, more and more we're going to start seeing fake news stories where there's actual really credible evidence, like a really credible picture or a really credible video. So like I mentioned earlier with that example with Eric Trump holding the shovel the wrong way, like that's just like baby steps towards what we could expect to see in the future, where it's going to be really convincing fake video footage or fake audio or fake images. So it's definitely good to, hone your fake spotting skills now, because it is only going to get harder in the future, unfortunately. So another website that I wanted to show you guys here is called Newsguard. So Newsguard is actually a browser extension. So it's something that you can download and put on your browser. And what it does is when you go to when you go to a news website, it's going to give you a whole write-up and it's going to rate it on 9 different categories. So if you go down to the bottom, I believe it shows them or shows you, oh no, here it is under about. Here we go, rating process. So it's going to show you the criteria. So it's going to rate everything on credibility, transparency, and it's going to give it like a nutrition label based on those ratings. So I already downloaded the extension onto Google so that we can look at it. Can somebody give me the name of a news website that they would like to see the rating for? Preferably something that's, right or left, so it's a little more juicy. Oh, just like any news source. So like, for instance, The Atlantic or MSNBC or Fox News or Daily Kos or something like that. Fox News? Sure. So let's go to Fox News. So if you had Newsguard downloaded on your machine, there's 2 different ways that it can do it. It can do this black-white version where it just shows that little shield icon with an eye, but it can also do that red-green version that I mentioned earlier, where it's actually going to show green versus red. So here you can see the rating that they give Newsguard. So you can see that the score is 69.5 out of 100. And here's all the things that they're rating them on. And if you go to this full nutrition label, it's going to give you like all of the reasons why they rated it that way. So, sorry, I think I just need to accept the cookies and agree. There we go. So it's going to show you the ownership and financing. And sometimes it's interesting because it'll show you like the historical ownership and financing if it's changed hands sometimes. It's going to give you this content. It's also going to give you the opinion section, like what they, it's going to tell you, oh, the opinion section publishes mostly this. So that's where you're going to get an idea if it is something like Fox News, where it's primarily a news source, but it also has like a conservative slant. It's going to tell you that that opinion section leans conservative. If you scroll down, it's going to tell you about their credibility. So it's going to tell you something about their anchors. It's also going to tell you whether their stories are credited. So sometimes you'll go to a news website and it'll show you a story, but then it won't even tell you who wrote it. And it's like, well, I can't really rate this if I don't know who wrote it. You can see that in the case of Fox News that it typically tells you who wrote it. So that's something that they mark as like a good thing in Newsguard. Like, it's great. They tell you who wrote this so you can decide whether to believe it based on who wrote it. So you can see that they go really, really deep into this. So like the write-ups are actually like super fascinating to read. And here's their transparency. So this is basically like your ownership. So like the example I gave earlier where the Nutri-Grain bar CEO tells you how amazing Nutri-Grain bars are. This is where they would go into like, no, this website that you're reading this on is owned by Nutri-Grain. So this tells you, Fox News is very clear about telling you who things are owned by. So they're very good on transparency. And then it gives you this little history. So it gives you the whole write-up of all of its background. And then it also gives you the information of who it was written by. Another thing that's interesting is they actually talk to people at that news source, and the people at the news source can, what's the word I'm looking for? They can dispute their ratings and they can fix their ratings. So an example is the website The Atlantic used to get a worse rating from Newsguard because they weren't transparent about their ownership. But in response to Newsguard and in response to their Newsguard rating, they actually made their website more transparent. So not only is it something where it's rating it, but sometimes, you know, like the observer effect, you can't just rate something in a vacuum. The websites react to these. So you can see really openly that the nutrition label was updated on this date and, you know, updated on this date. So it actually shows you like the ways that they updated it and then why. So if you want to get this on your machine, it does unfortunately cost like, I want to say like $2.95 a month, but they have a program where they do it for free at libraries and schools. So we're going to be getting this on our machines up in the computer lab in the next few months. So if it's something where you want to poke around it, or you're just curious to see, you know, the write-ups of the news sources you use most frequently, I would say definitely, you know, just stop by our computer lab and type something in. And similarly to all of the other websites we've looked at, if you go onto our team, they go really, really deep into who they are. So it's not just like, well, who are you to, you know, say that The Atlantic does or doesn't, you know, give transparency, or who are you to say that Fox News is conservative? They say exactly who they are and why they say that. So let's go ahead and stop again for questions before we do the game where we spot fake news and we spot fake profiles. Does anyone in person have any questions? And then we'll go to Zoom. Yeah, what's up? Yeah. Let me go back to PolitiFact here. So for everyone on Zoom, a person person here just mentioned that it says on the handout that PolitiFact rates things that politicians say. So I should have mentioned it earlier. You can actually, instead of just looking at the list of, you know, everything that, you know, they've rated recently, you can actually also look at people, and you can look at their truthfulness ratings over time. So let's just click on Kamala Harris because she's right here. So if you look here, it shows all of the checks that have come out these different ways. So it looks like 2 of her checks have come out like 100% true, 13 have come out mostly true, 4 have come out half true, 7 have come out mostly false, and then 7 have come out like utterly false. So like if you were curious, you could see, you know, what she said that's like, you know, totally utterly false. And if I had to, you know, wager a guess, I bet you that most of the things that politicians say that are totally false happen when they're campaigning. And then most of the stuff that they say that has a grain of truth happens when they're already in office. And I'm not picking on Kamala Harris specifically. I think that's just something that, you know, we've all noticed that there's a little bit more lying going on when people are trying to get elected. So with PolitiFact, you can get a really good idea of like how truthful certain politicians are over time. Another thing, if you're looking for more resources, and specifically some resources for around election time, if you go to our website to elmlib.org/vote, or if you go to eLibrary and then click on government, you'll be taken to a part of our website where we put together a bunch of voter resources. So some of these are more useful when you're actually voting. So for instance, Open Secrets, you can look at which people and organizations have donated to which politicians. So if you want to get like really nitty gritty on like a specific person where it's either you really don't like this person or you're considering voting for this person, but you're on the fence, some of the resources here on our website can be better for that. I mostly focused on some of the like fake news, real news stuff, but there's also a lot of really good stuff for tracking specific people. Yeah, so somebody in the audience just asked if that's all local. So some of it is local and some of it isn't. So for example, if you go to, let's see here, if you go to votesmart.org, that one asks of politicians at all levels. So you might find that, you know, it's people who are local, you might not. And then Vote 411 is one that's actually affiliated with the let's see here, with the League of Women Voters. So that one gets really, really nitty gritty into like very specific local issues. So the League of Women Voters does a lot with Vote 411, and they have, I believe, another guide as well that I'm blanking on the name of, but if you're at the back of the room where those books are, I have some cards from the League of Women Voters and from this website out there, so you'd be able to follow the links. They do really good write-ups on specifically local issues. So like, for example, when I put together the election binder for every election, this was one of the resources where I was able to find some really high quality information about all of our mayoral candidates. Because, you know, mayoral elections are a big deal and we had quite a few to choose from. So they had some pretty robust information about all of the choices there. Do we have any Zoom questions?
Yeah, we have a comment, and you might be planning on talking about this anyway, but Facebook feeds viewers what they want to see.
Mm-hmm. So it's not something I was planning on addressing in really great depth, but it's an absolutely good point. So someone on just, they can hear you, right? Because you have the microphone. Great. So because with social media platforms, the things that you click and like and share are going to lead to you getting more of the same, or maybe even getting more extreme versions of the same, that does, you know, feed you what you want to see. So like I mentioned earlier, let me go back to the slide where I mentioned it. Here we go. So one of the reasons why fake news is a problem is because of that increased polarization. So let's say, for example, that I am a slightly left-leaning person and I go on Facebook and I see an article that says something like, you know, I don't know, Bernie Sanders does everything that he can for the young people's vote. And I'll be like, ooh, wow, that sounds really cool. I'm a young people, I vote, and I like that article. You know, the next day I see an article that says, I don't know, like Bernie Sanders will wash your dishes and walk your dog. And I'd be like, wow, that sounds even better. And then eventually I might find myself, you know, in a situation where I'm reading things that, you know, have a very, you know, a very sort of unclose relationship to the truth, but that confirm things that I was already thinking. So that's why it's really important to be careful, especially when you're engaging with news that confirms your existing biases, that you're really careful there. Because that's how you can end up with, like, you know, a Facebook feed or a Twitter feed that's all people who are either agreeing with you or people who are saying, yes, and, you know, we should also do this. And that's part of why you've noticed that people, I mean, you've probably noticed in your personal life that, you know, maybe 30 years ago, everybody was, you know, more or less engaging with the same facts and issues. And like, I might believe that the tax rate should be a little higher. You might believe that it should be a little lower, but we can still be friends. Whereas now it's like, you are actually an awful person if you believe X, Y, Z. I can't even believe you, goodbye. So Facebook and other social media has sort of contributed to that, you know, increased polarization. So like the average Democrat and the average Republican are further left and right respectively than they were in the past. Let's see, do we have any more Zooms, and then we'll do an in-person?
We have a comment saying some people want to feel they know the truth instead of actually knowing the truth. The emotions are more powerful than the truth for some people.
Yeah. So I think that's another issue, especially when you're online, you know, in the privacy of your own home. You're not, you know, nobody's watching you. Nobody's like, you know, sitting on your shoulder being like, I don't know, Jan, is that really true? Or is that just something that confirms what you believe? Like, I know that, you know, if I'm like, you know, scrolling through news on my phone and I'm not, you know, putting on my best self librarian hat, I might look at a news source and be like, yeah, you know, that, you know, totally jives with something I was already thinking. I'm not necessarily going to, you know, put on my critical thinking cap today. So it's definitely true that sometimes it can be more comforting and more calming and just, you know, emotionally better in the moment to believe something that you want to be true, or to believe something that feels true, rather than to look into sources as to what's actually true. Let's see, anybody in person, and then we'll go to in Zoom again. All right, and now a word from our Zoomers.
What do you think of factcheck.org?
Yeah, so let's go to factcheck.org. So I know it's one that I've used in the past. Part of the reason why I put the ones on the website and on the handout that I do is just because it can be really overwhelming. Like, I've done previous versions of this presentation that were more focused on like a voter aspect. And I sometimes, I think, had so many links that I could see people's eyes glazing over. So I consciously pared back the list here. But I actually have a really high opinion of factcheck.org, especially the Annenberg Public Policy Center in general. They have a particularly good coverage of just like really basic American issues that we should all know. So if you go here, so Annenberg Classroom specifically, which also operates that fact check website, is a really good place for figuring out the definitions to those words that you know you've heard before, but you don't really quite know. I'll give an example. When I first started getting into politics when I was like a teenager, I heard that, oh yeah, he's a carpetbagger. You know, he doesn't really understand the local issues. At the time, I was like, yeah, he sure is a carpetbagger. But then later I was like, I don't actually know what a carpetbagger is. So when I was evaluating this resource when doing library stuff, and it gave the definition of carpetbagger, I was like, holy moly, I sort of remember that from like a million years ago, where I was just like, yeah, I sort of kind of know this, but it's a good way to check if you actually know things as well as you think you do. So it also has like the entire Constitution and sort of the no fear Shakespeare style. If you guys remember those no fear Shakespeare, like where like on one side it'll have Shakespeare's text and then on the other side it'll have plain text for the rest of us. This has kind of the same thing where it has the text of the Constitution and then it has the meaning of the Constitution. So I think this is one of those things where it's really easy to forget the civics that we learned in school. And it's good to sometimes just go back and be like, wait, do I understand this all as well as I think I do? But to go back to factcheck.org, yeah, that's another one that I would say is a pretty robust one. And I would say if you tend to prefer their interface, they're just as good as like media bias fact check and as some of the other ones that I've shown. It's just a matter of, you know, not overwhelming y'all with too many resources. All right, any in person, and then we'll try Zoom again. Or yeah, what's up? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so somebody in the audience asked, and this is a great question. When you're going to fact check something and you go to factcheck.org or one of the other sites, is that site itself biased? So that's when I would say that's when you want to really rely on what I mentioned earlier, which is this About Us page, and really look into who's writing these things. So I would say every single time you use it, you don't necessarily need to check this, but every once in a while, if you've been trusting a source like Fact Check for a long time, go ahead and read who you're actually getting this information from. So for example, for Newsguard, because we're adding it to library computers, I did like a super duper like deep dive. Like I did everything short of driving to these people's homes to figure out that, you know, they have our best interests at heart. But they do give a lot of information on their website. So I would say in the case of like, you know, trying to decide, you know, oh, well, do I trust the people from factcheck.org? Reading about who they are is a good idea. And similarly to what I mentioned earlier, where picking what stories to cover is in itself a form of bias. Similarly, choosing what claims to fact check is also a form of bias. In the case of most of the fact checking sites, they tend to pick things that are getting a lot of traction. So usually they won't bother fact checking something unless it's becoming a really pervasive misconception. So oftentimes they'll choose to, you know, find something that's like trending and then fact check that. But if it's just like, you know, let's say that there was like a really local thing where, you know, like Elmhurst Teen does XYZ, like they probably wouldn't cover that because they're looking for something that has like really widespread. Let's go ahead and do another Zoom if you've got one.
So Marty says, for entertainment, I used to listen to RT News on YouTube just to hear the obviously non-USA opinion. Just curious how the news evaluation websites evaluate RT News.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take a look. You know, I'm going to open it up in Google Chrome because that's the one that has Newsguard on it. And I find that their write-ups are not concise per se, but that they really get at like the main points. I know that I've heard from a lot of patrons in the past too, that they really like Al Jazeera News, which is another news source that is usually relatively nonpartisan, and is, I believe it's based in like Qatar. So it's definitely true that they'll rate news that comes from other countries too. So it looks like in the case of RT News, they actually get a pretty low rating. And again, I'm not saying that you need to like live and die and make all your decisions based on what these news rating websites say, but I do think that it's important to read them and see if you personally think that the claims are, good or bad. So like, here at the library, especially, like we're not super interested in telling you what to think, but we are super interested in helping you think critically. So I would say if you read this write-up and you're like, well, that doesn't really dovetail with my experience, you can always engage with that critically and see, how your viewpoint might be informed by these different rating services. So let's see. So if we look here, it looks like it gives us that, credibility. And sometimes it'll actually talk about specific news articles that they did and then give opinions based on like those specific news articles. So like this one here talks about a specific May 2021 opinion article titled Moderna's COVID-19 jab got the best vaccine award from a US dominated vaccine Congress stuffed with corporate goons. So regardless of your opinion here, I think we can all agree that corporate goons is one of those phrases that like you don't say corporate goons in a really unbiased kind of way. Like I wouldn't just be like, oh, what's up, my best friend corporate goon. Like that's not something that's like, you say about someone when you're trying to be super unbiased, which is fine because it's an opinion article. But I would say, if you look into the write-up, it'll give you an idea of like where this particular news website is coming from. And then you can use that to, give you an idea about whether you want to follow it. Because I think there are probably really good reasons to read RT News. Like if you're interested in, news specifically pertaining to Russia, they're probably more likely to cover it than a news source that has a more general bent. So I feel like every news source has something good about it. But these resources can give you an idea of like which ones you should trust for specific things, if that makes sense. Let's see, any in person, and then we'll go back to Zoom. No Zoom? All right. Any in person, and then we'll move on to the fact checking, the fake news spotting game. All right, let's move on. So this is the fun part where you all get to shout out whether you think something is real or not. Or I guess in Zoom's case, where Jez gets to shout out whether something is real or not. So Factitious is the website that put this together. And they've actually done a couple of different versions of this, like editions. So they did like a 2018 one around the midterm elections. This particular one is the pandemic edition. So if we click here, oh, I guess it does make noise. I apologize. Do you want me to turn the noise off, Jez? Okay, I'll just turn the noise off. It's not actually important anyway. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So it's going to show you different news articles. And then if you go to the bottom, you can also look at what the source is. And just because of time's sake, we'll look at the headline, we'll look at the news source, and then we'll see what we think. So in this case, New Jersey woman who gave a fake name and disappeared after testing positive for coronavirus is found. And the source here is nydailynews.com. Does anyone have a guess? Don't worry about just shouting something out. Like I said, I got some of these wrong too when I first did it and learned something. Sounds reasonable. All right, so let's go ahead.
One fake and one true.
Huh?
Zoom has one fake and one true.
All right, let's see. So I went ahead and did news just because that was the majority. So in this case, it looks like we're correct. That was a news article and we got 43 points. So it notes here that the NY Daily News has lower standards for accuracy, but the story is true. So sometimes, like we kind of talked about earlier, like even news sources that aren't perfect might still have things that are useful. So not every news source is going to be, the paragon of journalistic integrity, but there still might be some, kernels of truth in there. So let's do the next one. So Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others predicted up to 65 million deaths via coronavirus in a simulation ran 3 months ago. And this is from Infowars.com. What do we think?
Fake.
Huh? You say true? Anyone else? Any Zoomies?
We have 4 fake.
4 fake. Okay. So we're going to go for fake just because we've got the majority fake. So let's see, swipe left, swipe right. It kind of goes like those dating apps. So we'll swipe it towards fake. So in this case, it looks like it's a fake article, and it says here that InfoWars, run by Alex Jones, specializes in fake rumors and fabrications. So let's look at the next one here. Is this the man behind the global coronavirus pandemic? And then this is from zerohedge.com. No. I feel like reading it would be a lot when it's on a screen like this. So I feel like just based on the name of the news source and based on the headline and based on the picture, I mean, obviously when you're actually evaluating when something is fake news in real life, you might actually read the whole article, but this is just for fun since it's hard to read something, you know, on a screen like 10 feet away from you. Anyone have a guess? So in this case, is this the man behind the global coronavirus pandemic? I know this headline is not particularly usable compared to some of the others, but it looks like this one talks about how Dr. Peng Zhou, PhD, let's see. Let's go ahead and guess on this one. I'm going to guess it's fake. So it looks like in this case we were correct. So it tells us that this false story was so untruthful that Twitter banned the site, and gives us a little bit more information here. And it looks like one of the interesting tells that this is fake is the author is Tyler Durden from the movie Fight Club, which is a little bit funny. So we'll do another one here and then we'll move on to fake people. So unbelievable act of kindness. Mystery man buys up Needham florist inventory ahead of new coronavirus business restrictions. And this one is from boston.cbslocal.com. So it's like the Boston CBS affiliate. Any Zoom? Huh?
4 people say true.
All right, let's give true a shot. So yeah, it looks like in this case it's correct. So it was like I said, it's the Boston affiliate of CBS. So that's kind of just, you know, one of those feel good stories. Like you probably, you know, could go the rest of your life without knowing that this dude was really nice to a florist. But sometimes those feel good stories are something that you can trust. So let's see. Yeah, and it is nice. Oh, somebody in person just said probably because those feel good stories are so rare. And yeah, it can definitely feel that way when you're reading the news, that there's a little bit more focus on the depressing things than on the things that are, you know, good news or not depressing. So let's go to this one. And this one is really interesting because it shows you examples of real profiles that were found online and then digs deep to figure out whether that was a real person or a fake person. So let's go to profile 1 here. And this one is just 8 profiles. So you're going to decide if one is an authentic account or if it's a troll. And then after each profile, it'll also show you the signs that it's a troll. So for this first one, we have Chloe Evans. It looks like she's a student from Atlanta. So we've got a picture of her. Looks like we've got a picture of a horse. We've got an article from CNN. We've got a quote here from Omar and Bradley. We've got a little personal detail that she used to be a model. We've got another quote and we've got another quote. Does anybody want to just, you know, using their horse sense, so to speak, want to guess whether this one's real or fake? Yeah, so, oh, like the top here. So in this particular case, it's actually somebody's Twitter profile. So her name is Chloe Evans and she's a student in Atlanta. So it's not like there's a title with these. This is like figuring out if someone is a real profile. So let me back up a little bit. Sometimes if you're online, you might see profiles where, like, let's say it's just, you know, somebody's picture and they've never tweeted anything ever, but they follow a bunch of different accounts. Oftentimes that's people making fake accounts so that they can pad their followers, or, you know, making fake accounts so that they can share different articles that might be, you know, inflammatory or might cause arguments. So this exercise is about trying to figure out, you know, which Twitter accounts seem like they're from real people versus which ones have been, you know, traced back to various efforts to, you know, cause discord and dissension. Any guesses on Zoom? Troll? Okay, let's give it a shot. All right, it looks like this is correct. So in this case, Chloe is a Russian-made troll account. So hundreds of Twitter accounts like Chloe were active throughout 2014 and 15. And you can see that they're from this internet internet research agency in Russia. So unfortunately, over time, the agency has actually gotten much better at its job at creating people who are real. So if you continue here to the signs, like creating people who seem real, not actually creating people who are real, but creating people who have more of the hallmarks of being real. And we'll get onto some of the hallmarks of a real person when we move on here. So it looks like some of the things that, made Chloe look like kind of a troll is that she is posting a fake story, which is actually photoshopped to look real. So oftentimes, and this is not saying anything one way or the other about women who are attractive, but oftentimes these troll accounts will just use like a generic image of like a pretty young woman, because that's more likely to get people to, look at the account. And then you can see here the full analysis of Chloe. And you can see here that these accounts actually often use stolen images. So there's like probably someone out there who actually looks like Chloe, who's just like, that's not me. But they're using her picture. So let's go on to another profile. So here we have Harmony Anderson. It looks like she is a college girl who identifies as a conservative. She's from Ankeny, Iowa. So we've got an article here that she's sharing about 2020 voting stuff. It looks like we've got an article here as well from, let's see, about the Democratic Party that's got sort of a negative point of view. We've got a retweet of Melania Trump. We have something about how, it looks like a retweet of James Woods talking about the first lady or the former first lady. We've got something here that's a video about Joe Biden that's a little sassy. We've got an old interview. So what do you guys think? Do you think this one's legit or troll? You want to say no? Do we have any Zoom ideas? Okay. So how many reels on Zoom? I'll give troll a shot then. It looks like that's the one that's coming in. So it looks like in this particular case, you're correct. So it's another troll. So it looks like something that the trolls commonly do is they'll pose as a young woman who has very strong political opinions and who sets herself directly opposite to people who are on the other side, or sometimes, fake people who are on the other side. So it looks like Harmony's goal is to make people, more entrenched and to make compromise more difficult. So if you continue to some of the signs, and this is, I think, one of the biggest ones to pay attention to, is this lack of personal info. Like you don't ever see Harmony posting like, oh my gosh, my dog did something so cute. Like Harmony is always just like Melania Trump, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, blah, blah, blah. And like most people in real life are not like always super obsessed with politics. They're also going to be posting things like, oh, my child got an A or, whatever. So there's none of that like identifying information or depth that you'd expect from a real person. It looks like it's also pretty common for troll accounts to retweet prominent voices. And just to be clear, I'm not implying that Melania Trump was like paying someone to retweet her. This is just something that those trolls do. It's not something where, Melania Trump wanted her to do that or paid for her to do that or anything like that. So if you can see here, it looks like Harmony is consistent with a bunch of different accounts that did something similar. And it goes into some of the things that she shared. So here's another one. So this is Christopher Warwick, who lives in Columbia City. It looks like he's got a meme here about the national anthem. He has something from Chick-fil-A. It looks like he's got a picture of himself and either his daughter or granddaughter in his tractor. He's got a picture of Jesus and flags. He's got a picture of a local lunch place in his city. He's got another meme. He has a thing about coronavirus in Indiana. So what do we think? Troll or legit? Legit? What's the thoughts on Zoom? Real? All right. And you're correct, legit. So it looks like in this case, Chris is a real person. He's a kind husband and father living in Columbia City. It looks like in this case, they can confirm he's real because the people who made this know him personally. So they definitely know that he's real, unless he's like a super deep fake, actually. So some of the signs, and I think that you guys picked up on, is that he posts about normal stuff. Like he posts about his life. Like he's not just like a nonstop blah, blah, blah politics machine. He's also, posting about his kids and the place that he ate for lunch and, the normal things that everyone posts about. And you can see that he's got some multi-dimensional. What's up? Oh, like where was this profile from? Oh, so somebody in the audience is asking where he posted this. It looks like in this particular case, I think it's a Facebook profile because you can see the little F right here. So it looks like this is Christopher's Facebook profile. So another example of him being a real person, that his views are multidimensional. So he tweets some things that, maybe have a more right bias, but he also tweets some things that, poke fun at the president. So he's got that, going where, most people that are more complex than just, always falling on one side or always falling on the other. So let's do another one. So we've got Power to Women, and we've got Rosie the Riveter in a little caricature being a little bit unkind to Trump. It looks like she identifies as a feminist. She's got a picture, a meme. She's got a Bernie Sanders thing. She's got a Bernie Sanders thing. She has a retweet, it looks like, of a conference. She has a picture of a pro-choice thing. She's got a thing about women's health. So what do we think? Legit or troll? Troll? All right. And you are correct. So this Instagram account, it looks like this one's from Instagram, Power to Women, is a troll. So this is another one that was originating in Russia. And if you look at that full analysis, so it looks like in this particular case, Power to Women isn't really even pretending to be a person. She's pretending to be a group, but like the group is made up. So like you might look at this and be like, oh, Power to Women, this must be like an actual group of actual feminists. But in this case, it's just a made up group made up by Russia to make us all, a little bit angrier at each other. And if you look at it here, you can see that Power to Women often paints the world in very contrasting terms. So like there are people who are for you and then people who are against you, whereas real people are often a little bit more, shades of gray than that. And you can see here, oh yeah, it looks like there's some theories here that Russian IRA supported Senator Sanders for president. So that's kind of interesting. All right, so going on to another profile here. So we've got Amy G, who is a daughter, sister, proud Black American, and she tends to get political. So we've got this thing about Trump and coronavirus. We've got Michelle Obama. We have a thing about Trump. We have a thing about voting on probation. We have a thing about jail. It looks like we have a meme about Republican logic. So what do we think? Real or troll? Want to say real? Anyone on Zoom? Evenly split. Let's go with real then, because that's what I heard first. So it looks like in this case, it's actually not true. So in this case, Amy is a Russian who is pretending to be a left-leaning Black woman. And it looks like they're saying that's a pretty common tactic among trolls. And it looks like her strategy is to, engage with left-leaning users and then use her influence to manipulate users' conversations and get them to lean more left. So the whole idea here is to, stir up dissension and then go further left. And if you look at some of the signs here, let's see. So it looks like this technique is referred to as digital blackface. And it gives some examples here of different things that, like different groups that users pretend to be a part of. All right, so we'll go through this one pretty quickly because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So this one is going to be a real profile. And some of the hints towards that are the fact that this person is giving some very specific information. Like they are an assistant professor in media studies at a specific place. So it's kind of hard to think that somebody who's that specific would, be a fake troll, because it's just so easy to go on Rutgers University's website and talk in, and type in Chendrai's name and be like, oh yeah, obviously this person is real. And you can see also that he tweets things that are a little bit more local. So you can see that maybe he has some of the same politics as the previous person, but he's also more multifaceted. And you can see also that he, is posting something about, not politics, like about his Adobe audition. And then you can see, yeah, that, like I mentioned, the identifiable information is a big hint. And then that focus on local issues over national issues. And then you can see this one is, like a pro-police thing. from Nevada. I believe this one was a troll. Yeah, so it looks like this one was a troll. So it is that same sort of idea. So it's like from one particular point of view. What's going on?
Marty pointed out that the previous one, they joined in 2009. That's a good way to figure out if it's real or not.
Yes. So that's another really, so what Marty just brought up is another really good point. If you look when people joined, that can sometimes be a really good hint of, did they just join recently or have they been part of it forever? But sometimes it does get a little more muddied. Like you'll have people who are, hacking accounts and they like revive an account that a real person created a long time ago, but then they start, suddenly and all of a sudden like posting a bunch of stuff. So that's another hint. Like if I created my Instagram in 2014 and then I posted absolutely nothing, and then in 2019, I suddenly started pushing out like a ton of left-wing memes, you might be like, I wonder if this person is legit. Like, why did she suddenly start deciding to use her Instagram? So that's another hint. So here's another one. So this is Mike Adams, the health ranger. He's a consumer health advocate. And it looks like he's posting a bunch of different information about, let's see, like chemicals and genetic engineering and farming and wheatgrass and stuff like that. And in this particular case, he's a real person. So he's a founder of a website called Natural News. So it looks like his Facebook page is a tool that he uses to promote his website. So maybe not every single thing that he posts is like, 100% scientific, but he's not a fake person. He just has a particular, viewpoint. And you can kind of get an idea here that another thing too, it looks like is a trigger for fake news is if something isn't available. Oftentimes fake news websites will, spring up like mushrooms after rain and then go away just as quickly because they're trying to get something out there and then, very quickly disappear before people can fact check it. So it looks like our score here is 7 out of 8. So that means that trolls fear us, and that's pretty cool. All right, and I think we've got a little time now for questions. Do we have any in persons? And then I'll check on the Zoom folks. Let's check on Zoom folks. Oh, wow, there's a lot of stuff in the chat. Hopefully it's not like, presenter's terrible. Let's see, we've got until 8:30, so I'll just give it a minute to see if anyone thinks of questions either on Zoom or online. In the meantime, while folks are thinking of questions, I did just want to share with you that we've got some more programs coming up that could be really interesting. So on Tuesday, the 26th at 1:30 p.m., we have an in-person only meeting of our Great Decisions group. So what the Great Decisions group does is they all read an article, usually about foreign policy, and then they get together and discuss it. And we have a really cool local professor who coordinates the discussion. So it's a really good time. I can tell you guys are all, engaged news reading people. So it's a good group for doing that kind of thing. Also on Tuesday, 10/26 at 7, we've got a program about trick-or-treating and the cultural history of Halloween. So it's pretty awesome that we've got that coming up just a few days before Halloween. So if you want to learn a lot about Halloween in time for the holiday, I think that would be a good one to attend. And that one is a hybrid. So you can come either in person or online. And then one that I particularly want to plug on November 16th, it's a Tuesday, we have a program called How Elmhurst City Government Works. So it's really good for getting into that local issue that a participant mentioned earlier. So Marty Deuter, who is the Ward 1 alderman from Elmhurst, is actually going to come here. And she's going to present about, how our local city government works. And then she'll be on hand for questions. And it's not very often that you have an alderman to be your captive audience. So it's definitely one to come to, if you've had, burning questions about Elmhurst and you just never had somebody to ask it of. I know that I didn't really understand how city government worked until I started doing more with, civic engagement. So I think it's one of those things that a lot of us don't understand as well as we think we do. So it's definitely an interesting program. Any questions on Zoom?
Which federal agency is responsible for preventing fake news from foreign sources?
Gotcha. So that is a good question. Offhand, I think it's the FCC, but let me check that. So it looks like they are the ones responsible in the case of domestic things. One issue with fake news from foreign sources is it's something that's very hard to stamp out because it's something that's happening overseas and it's something over which the US doesn't have a great deal of control. And sometimes the governments where this is happening, like the countries don't necessarily care one way or the other whether the US is being inundated with fake news. So it's hard to sometimes get those governments to cooperate with the US when we try to do that. So let's see. I know the FCC and the FTC are jointly responsible for like those scam calls and spam calls you get from overseas, which is why my mind immediately went to the FCC. Yeah, I hesitate to say one way or the other because I don't know offhand which particular unit of federal government is responsible for it. I would say that's one where it might be helpful to go to like the us.gov website and just poke around and see. I would definitely be able to do that. That's actually, let me backtrack. A really good way to get this answer to this question would be to come to the reference desk or call us, because then we would be able to do a little more searching. I'm just hesitant to commit to something when I'm searching on a laptop on here. But if you give us a call or if you email me, and my email is on this last slide. If you email me, that's definitely something I can give you more information about, but I don't want to speculate too irresponsibly. Any other Zoom questions? All right, any in-person questions or comments? Those are okay too. Yeah, so someone in person asked, do you find that all of this stuff, I assume you mean like fake news, causes people to engage more or to tune it out? I would say it's kind of a mix of both. I would say there's some people where, again, that politics as spectator sport idea, like they're, on tenterhooks seeing if their team is going to win. And I would say in some ways they engage more, but they don't engage constructively. And then I think there's people, for example, like my mom, who are just like, they're all liars anyway, and I never know who's telling the truth. Just tell me who to vote for, and I guess I might vote maybe. So I would say it's definitely a mix of people who are just turned off by how polarized we've become versus people who are like, yes, I'm so here for it. This is just like supporting the Bears against the Packers, but everyone cares instead of just football fans. Let's see, any other questions or comments? I will say one thing is that most people that I've talked to about these kinds of topics are definitely interested in learning more. Like very rarely do I talk to someone and they're like, that's all fine and dandy, but I just want to keep, reading the same 3 sources that I always read and not engage critically. Like most people want to, read more broadly, but they don't know how necessarily. Or for some people that I know, like it just makes them really angry to read things by the other side. And I get that. Like if you've got a really strong point of view, sometimes it can just be emotionally difficult to read somebody who doesn't, who doesn't value the same things that you do. I would say one thing that's been helpful for me when engaging with people who have different politics than mine is just to ask why they think that, or to ask like why they believe that. So like, for example, my brother and I are like very different politically, but we've had enough discussions about it that we've come to the conclusion of like why he thinks that. Like for him, things like responsibility is very important, and like the debts that he owes to his family is really important. And for me, because I work in the library and I'm a big old goober about it, like information is really important, and access to information and having everybody be able to get information that's good and reliable and true is really important. So sometimes it can be interesting to read news sources that you don't agree with from the perspective of, why are you saying this? What do you value? Like, what's your priority here? Like, I find sometimes that, like, if you think, oh, they're angry about immigration because they see it as an issue of fairness, or like they're angry about immigration because they're seeing it as an issue of safety, or just like looking towards so it sounds to me like this person really values safety, or it sounds to me like this person values fairness. rather than necessarily getting, overly engaged with the content of what they're saying. It can sometimes be useful to think about the reason they're saying it or about the unspoken values that are leading them to take that point of view. Let's see, any more Zoom questions or in-person questions or comments? And I think if not, we can call it a night.
So Marty says how to prevent an argument over turkey dinner when a relative brings up fake news. I did mention that we've done a program on this before. Yes. They said we should do it again.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Aaliyah, who's the head of kids, and I, and Jez, and Mari, who's our inclusive services coordinator, collaborated on a program that kind of addresses that, like, well, how do you talk to family members who disagree? And I would say it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about looking at why someone thinks that rather than looking at the content of what they're saying. And then also sometimes the reason why those conversations get so out of hand is because they're in a group setting. So like if you're at a turkey dinner and your whole family is liberal and you're a conservative and they're just like piling on you and being like, well, you're this and you're a racist and you're awful. Like it's hard to have a good conversation, and vice versa. Like if you're, at your family full of conservatives and they're just like, well, you would just let anyone in the country. It can be really difficult to feel like you can get a word in edgewise. So I would say sometimes those conversations are better just between one person and one person. Like sometimes I think it's that group setting that makes it really fraught. One organization, and I'm just going to be really quick with this because I know we're right up against time, is there's an organization that I've been really interested in recently called Braver Angels that's all about helping people who have really different political views talk to each other. So, bringing people who have, they call them reds and blues, but you could easily call them like Republicans and Democrats. Just bringing people together to have conversations. I'm definitely planning to do some of their programming in the future. I know the Glen Ellen Library is doing one of their programs coming up. So I'm actually going to attend that one, see how it goes, and then maybe do some here based on how that goes. But I think it's definitely an organization to look into. I participated on one of their programs online that was actually all about, how to have conversations with family members who disagree with you. And I ended up being paired with somebody from like Ohio who was having a really hard time talking to her son who lives in Seattle and has like a totally different political opinion from her. So I would say the Braver Angels programs are a really good place to start if you're looking to get better at talking to people who don't agree with you. And also just, approaching from a position of love and respect and not ever approaching from that position of, I'm going to convince them, or I'm going to own the libs, or I'm going to, show those Republican what for, like to always approach it from, this is a person that I love and respect, and I want us to get along. And then sometimes if they're just, getting feisty at you when you're trying to eat turkey, just being like, wow, this isn't the time or space for this. Let's, just get back to eating all this delicious food. Let's see, any other thoughts or comments? Otherwise, I think I'm going to let you guys go and start making you be my captive audience.
That's a good one to close on. Jan says you can't open a closed mind.
Yes, for sure. I would say definitely just focus on the fact that you can change yourself. You can choose to read more widely. You can choose to engage more with, real news sources, but you can't necessarily convince other people to do the same. And you're going to make yourself, very stressed out if you try to focus on changing other people rather than changing yourself. All right, I think that's all I've got. So thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks for coming on Zoom too. I can't see you all, but you're in my heart.